Okay, so I've gone ahead and brought back our nav bar here. Now let's try and drop our account dropdown into the top right corner here and see what happens. So I've got the nav bar here, account dropdown open over here. First thing I'm going to do, sort of a view specific thing, but I do need to import the account dropdown components. So we'll make sure that we add that here. Import account dropdown from /account dropdown. And then we should be able to just go to sort of the end of this list here and add the account dropdown. Okay, so things are royally screwed up, of course. This is not how we want things to look. So let's talk about sort of the reason for this. Right now, what's happening is the account dropdown is sort of designed to take up like this much space, right? And even though this dropdown sort of like looks like it's floating, it's not actually floating on top of the page. So it's causing the nav bar to sort of grow in height to accommodate the dimensions of the actual dropdown itself. So what we need to do is figure out a way to sort of take this dropdown element sort of out of the flow of the actual page so it doesn't disrupt the parent layout in the nav bar. So why don't I walk you through how we can actually pull that off. So the trick here is going to be to use absolute positioning to make sure that this dropdown, again, is not really considered part of the regular flow of the page. I'll show you what happens if we just go ahead and add the absolute class to this dropdown area. You can see that instantly all the nav stuff goes back to exactly how it was, but of course the dropdown is sort of in a weird place, not where it's supposed to be. So what's happening here is when we set this to absolute, it's taken out of the flow of the page, so it doesn't affect the position of anything around it, but it still is rendered in the place that the browser sort of wants to render it, sort of the place that it would have been had it not been position absolute. Now, if we want this to sort of be like, say, right aligned, where the dropdown is actually sort of over here on the left and the edge of it sort of is up against the right, we can do that by adding a class like right0 that says sort of the right bounds of this element should be positioned 0 pixels from the edge. So if we save that, you can see now, okay, the dropdown is looking a little bit better. It is, right up against the edge of the viewport. Now, you might be thinking we're done here, but we have to be a little bit careful. Look at what happens if I change the padding on this nav bar. So up here, we have this sort of like px4, which is controlling like the space on the left and right. Say I made this like px10, so we have a lot more space. Notice how the drop down doesn't actually move, even though the button moved. This is a sign that we've sort of wired things up in a way where we haven't defined the correct sort of relationships between elements. So what's happening when you set something to position absolute is by default, it's placing it relative to the nearest, what's called in the spec, positioned container. So by default, none of these elements are considered positioned. They all have a position of static by default. And when an absolute element encounters a statically positioned parent, it basically ignores its position and keeps looking up the tree to look for the next nearest positioned element. Now, by default, the only sort of positioned element in the tree is the actual body element. So right now, this dropdown is always being positioned relative to sort of the entire viewport. So when we say right 0, we're saying 0 pixels from the entire body, not 0 pixels from like any sort of explicitly defined container. So the solution to this in our case is to actually create a positioned element somewhere in the tree that's going to make this sort of show up in the correct place. I think the best place to do that is going to be this div here. So if we give this a class of relative, that's going to make the browser treat it almost exactly the same way it treats statically positioned elements, except now it sort of counts as like a position reference or a position anchor. It's considered a positioned element, which means any absolute positioned elements inside of it are going to be positioned relative to this element. So when we say right 0 here, we're saying 0 pixels from the right edge of this div. Now, since this div is inside of this header, when we change the horizontal padding on the header, that affects the location of this div, which in turn affects the location of this one, since this one is sort of anchored to this one. So now if we set this back to px4, which it was originally, you can see everything sort of moves together in a way that makes sense. Now, one thing that's also important to understand is that here we are actually relying on the fact that by default, when you give an element position absolute, the browser renders it exactly where it would have been without position absolute. So say, for example, we tried to give this like a top of 0. You're going to see that it jumps all the way up to the top, right on top of this button here. Now, the only reason there's a little gap here is because we have this MT2 class added, but there's actually no way to sort of like add a class that's going to get this to go to the right place. We are sort of intentionally relying on this like sort of top auto behavior that makes sure to put it where the browser would normally render it so that we actually have it end up, underneath the button the way that we want. The alternative to this would be like trying to figure out, okay, what's the exact height of this button and setting a top equal to that exact amount, which to me is just like a little bit too magic number-ish, too much weird stuff. In this case, I think it's a lot better to rely on sort of this like magic browser behavior where it just happens to put it in the right spot so that if the height of this button was to ever change, right? Like say we were to set this to like H12, W12, the dropdown is always going to stay underneath it because it's rendering exactly where the browser would render it if we didn't have position absolute. By setting right 0, we're only sort of positioning it on the x-axis and letting the y-axis sort of stay where it should automatically be. So one other thing that I would like to change here, you can see that the button is kind of like really close to this messages link. So why don't we add a little bit of space there? I'm going to do that in the actual nav bar. So let's go ahead and add a class here, and maybe we'll give this like a margin left of 6 or something like that. Yeah, and I think that looks pretty good, gives us a little bit of space. Now, of course, this dropdown doesn't actually work like a dropdown. When we click this button, nothing happens. There's no way for it to make it disappear. So in the next lesson, using Vue, I'll show you how to make this dropdown actually open and close when we click that button, as well as how to make it close on escape and even close when you click sort of the background outside of the dropdown area.